Boston on Christmas Eve wore its holiday best like a promise kept for everyone except Vivian Hart. Snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, blanketing the cobblestone streets in white while fairy lights wrapped around every lamppost, casting golden reflections onto the wet pavement below. Carol music drifted from shop doorways where last-minute shoppers hurried past with armfuls of gifts, their laughter rising like steam into the frozen air. Families walked hand in hand, children tugging at their parents' sleeves, faces bright with anticipation. The entire city looked like a Christmas card come to life. But as Vivian stood outside the Green Lantern Bistro, smoothing the emerald fabric of her dress one final time, she could not shake the feeling that no card in that perfect collection had ever been addressed to her. She was 30 years old, with honey blonde hair that fell past her shoulders and eyes the color of winter sky. The dress she had chosen was elegant, fitted just enough to flatter without trying too hard. Emerald, she had decided, because it matched her eyes and because she wanted to look like a fresh start rather than a familiar failure. Vivian worked in marketing for a Boston agency, the kind of woman clients trusted with their campaigns and colleagues respected for her sharp mind. She was good at her job. She was good at most things. But somewhere along the way, the men she dated had developed a habit of telling her she was too much of something and never quite enough of something else. Too ambitious, they said. Too direct. Too independent. The last one had put it simply before walking out of her apartment for the final time. "You are great," he had told her. "Just not for me." She had heard variations of that sentence so many times that she had begun to believe it was less about them and more about some invisible flaw woven into the fabric of who she was. Tonight was supposed to be different. Her best friend Andrea had been trying for months to convince Vivian to try again, to put herself back out there despite every bruise her heart had collected. Andrea was happily married with 2 children, the kind of woman who believed love was simply a numbers game, and that Vivian just had not met her number yet. When she had called last week with news of a blind date, a decent guy named Clinton, smart and stable and single. Vivian had almost said no, but Andrea had already declined enough of her Christmas Eve invitations on Vivian's behalf, and the guilt of ruining another holiday with her persistent singleness had finally won out. "It is just one dinner," Vivian had told herself while getting ready. The worst that could happen was she would go home alone to her apartment, order pizza, and watch something mindless on television. The best that could happen was something she had stopped allowing herself to imagine. The hostess led her to table 9, a small round table near the window draped in white linen and illuminated by a single flickering candle. 2 wine glasses stood empty, waiting to be filled. Vivian slid into her seat, arranged her napkin across her lap, and tried not to look at the clock on the wall. Around her, the restaurant hummed with holiday warmth. Couples leaned toward each other, sharing bites of pasta and whispered jokes. A family nearby erupted in laughter as their youngest smeared sauce across his cheek. The air smelled of butter and garlic and possibility, and Vivian allowed herself one small breath of hope. 10 minutes passed. She checked her phone and sent a polite message. "I am here. Take your time. 20 minutes. Perhaps traffic was bad, she reasoned, or he had trouble finding parking. These things happened. 35 minutes crept by, and the server returned to ask if she would like to order something while she waited. She declined with a smile that felt increasingly difficult to hold. Around her, the warmth of the restaurant seemed to press in like a reminder of everything she did not have. Then he arrived. Clinton Reeves walked through the door like a man who had somewhere better to be. Tall and polished in a tailored vest, he smelled of expensive cologne and moved with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His eyes found Vivian almost immediately, and she watched something flicker across his face. A quick assessment followed by the unmistakable shadow of disappointment. He did not apologize for being late. He simply slid into the chair across from her. His phone still in his hand, thumb scrolling through notifications as if she were barely worth looking at. Vivian straightened in her seat and attempted a smile. "You must be Clinton." "I am." He cut her off without looking up. "I am Clinton. Look, I will be honest with you." She felt her stomach drop before he even finished the sentence. "My mother is the one who set this up," he continued, finally pocketing his phone and meeting her eyes with the expression of a man delivering bad news he felt no particular obligation to soften. "She wants grandchildren and apparently thinks my standards are the problem." He paused, giving her a look that made clear he did not share his mother's opinion. "No offense, but you are not really what I am looking for." Vivian's fingers curled around the edge of the tablecloth beneath her lap. She did not trust her voice, so she simply waited. "It is just that you seem—" He waved his hand vaguely. "Assertive. Strong. I prefer women who are softer, more accommodating." He shrugged as if this were simply a matter of taste, like preferring red wine to white. "Anyway, no hard feelings." "Right. Merry Christmas." He stood, brushed invisible lint from his vest, and walked out of the restaurant without ordering so much as a glass of water. Vivian sat frozen in her seat. Around her, life continued as if nothing had happened. A couple nearby clinked glasses and kissed. Children at another table sang an off-key version of a Christmas song. The candle between her two empty wine glasses flickered and danced, casting shadows across the white linen. But all of it felt distant now, muffled, as if someone had wrapped the world in cotton and left her alone in the silence at its center. She turned her face toward the wall, hoping no one would notice the mascara beginning to burn at the corners of her eyes. Her hands trembled in her lap, gripping the fabric of her dress to keep them still. Every rejection she had ever experienced came flooding back. Every variation of the same theme. The insistence that she was wonderful, but somehow wrong. That someone else would be lucky to have her, but that someone was never, ever them. Maybe they were right. Maybe there was something fundamentally unlovable about her, something broken that she could not see but everyone else could. Maybe she was simply not the kind of woman that anyone would ever choose to bring home. She reached for her coat, ready to escape before anyone could witness the full extent of her unraveling. And then a tiny hand touched her arm. Vivian looked down, startled, and found herself staring into the wide hazel eyes of a little girl who could not have been more than 3 years old. She wore a red velvet dress with a white collar, her brown curls falling in loose ringlets around her face. In one arm, she clutched a well-loved teddy bear whose fur had gone thin from too many hugs. "Excuse me," the child said, her voice soft but clear. "Why are you sad?" Vivian blinked, too surprised to answer. The little girl tilted her head, studying Vivian with the uncomplicated concern that only children possess. "Do you need a hug?" Hugs help when faces look droopy. Before Vivian could respond, a man appeared behind the child, his hand settling gently on her small shoulder. He was tall, with broad shoulders, dressed simply in a black sweater with his coat still dusted with snowflakes. His eyes were gray, the color of storms that had already passed, and though his expression was serious, there was something warm beneath the surface. "Bridget." "Sweetheart," he said quietly. "We do not just walk up to strangers like that." "But, Daddy?" The little girl protested. "She looks like she needs someone to be nice to her." The man glanced at Vivian, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Perhaps of a pain he understood better than most. "I am so sorry," he said. She is very friendly, does not quite grasp the concept of personal boundaries yet. Vivian shook her head, surprising herself by smiling even as tears threatened to spill. She is wonderful, without a word. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small package of tissues, which he set on the table in front of her before stepping back. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer advice or platitudes. He simply gave her what she needed and allowed her the dignity of not having to explain. The little girl named Bridget watched this exchange with apparent satisfaction before tugging on her father's hand. "Daddy, she does not have anyone to eat with. Can she eat with us?" The man looked genuinely flustered for the first time. "Bridget, I am sure she—" "Please," Bridget said, turning those enormous hazel eyes back to Vivian. "We have really good chicken. Well, Daddy calls and they bring it, but it tastes like he made it." Vivian laughed, a real laugh that cracked through the shell of hurt she had been trying to hold together. She looked at the little girl, then at her father, and felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight for a very long time. "I would like that," she said. "Very much." The man's name was Carter Hale, and his daughter was Bridget, within minutes. The hostess had moved them to a larger table near a window frosted with snow, and Vivian found herself sitting across from a stranger while a 3-year-old arranged their seating like a social director at a very small party. "You sit here," Bridget instructed Vivian, patting the chair to her left. "And Daddy sits there. Now we are like a sandwich." Carter caught Vivian's eye and shrugged helplessly, but there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "She is bossy," he said. "I do not know where she gets it." Bridget, clearly uninterested in discussing her own personality, launched into a detailed account of her day that included a cat named Menace she had spotted on the sidewalk, the precise number of snowflakes she had caught on her tongue, and her absolute certainty that she had seen Santa outside the grocery store. Vivian listened, genuinely charmed, as the tension in her shoulders began to slowly unwind. There was something about the little girl's unfiltered enthusiasm that made the humiliation of the past hour feel strangely distant. She found herself laughing at Bridget's descriptions, asking questions, leaning into the conversation like a plant turning toward sunlight it had forgotten existed. Carter, for his part, said little. He was attentive to his daughter in ways that seemed automatic rather than performed, cutting her chicken into small pieces, reminding her gently to use her napkin, placing a cloth across her lap without interrupting her monologue. At one point, he reached across the table and placed a second napkin beside Vivian's plate. "In case the snow followed you in," he said simply, and she realized he had noticed her still damp coat, the chill that had settled into her bones before she even entered the restaurant. It was such a small thing, but it had been a very long time since anyone had noticed the small things about her. As they ate, Bridget suddenly grew quiet and looked at Vivian with unusual seriousness. "Do you know what I really want for Christmas?" Vivian smiled. "What is that?" "A mommy," Bridget said. "Can you be mine?" The air at the table seemed to freeze. Carter's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and Vivian watched a shadow of old pain flicker across his face before he carefully set down his utensils. The little girl waited, unaware that she had touched something tender. "Bridget," Carter said quietly, his voice gentle but strained. "We talked about this, but I prayed for one." Bridget insisted. "Maybe she is my answered prayer." Carter met Vivian's eyes across the table, and she saw something there that surprised her. Not embarrassment, not anger, just a deep, weary grief that he had clearly been carrying for a very long time. "Her mother," he said quietly, as if Bridget could not hear, although she clearly could. "Passed away when Bridget was 1. A car accident. Drunk driver." Vivian's heart clenched. "I am so sorry." Carter nodded, his jaw tight. She does not really remember Larissa. She just knows there used to be someone and now there is not. Vivian turned to the little girl, who was watching her with those impossibly hopeful eyes. She reached out and took Bridget's small hand in hers, choosing her words with extraordinary care. "I do not know, sweet girl," she said softly. "But I do know that you are wonderful. Anyone would be lucky to be part of your family." Bridget considered this answer for a moment, then nodded as if filing it away for future reference. She turned to her father with satisfaction evident on her small face. "Daddy, she is not sad anymore. I fixed her." Carter looked at his daughter, then at Vivian, and for just a moment, something cracked open in his expression, something that looked almost like hope. 3 days after Christmas, Vivian received a text message from a number she did not recognize. It turned out to be Carter. He wanted to thank her properly for being so kind to his daughter. And he wondered if she might like to meet for coffee. Just coffee, he emphasized. No pressure. She almost said no. The memory of Clinton's dismissal still stung, and the last thing she wanted was to set herself up for another rejection. But something about Carter, about the way he had handed her tissues without asking questions, about the careful way he had watched over his daughter, made her curious. She met him at a small cafe overlooking the Charles River. The windows were fogged with condensation, and outside, the water moved slowly beneath a gray winter sky. A young barista hummed a carol quietly behind the counter while Carter and Vivian sat across from each other, hands wrapped around warm mugs, and began the slow work of trading stories. He told her about Larissa, about how wild and brave she had been, always late to everything, full of chaos and laughter and life. He told her about the night he got the phone call, about racing to the hospital only to find he was too late for a final goodbye. He told her about learning to be a father alone, about building walls around himself and Bridget because he did not know how to do anything else. Vivian told him about the men who had come and gone, about the endless variations of "you are wonderful." But about how she had started to believe there was something wrong with her, some invisible flaw that made her easy to leave and impossible to keep. Carter picked up a silver spoon and turned it so she could see her own reflection, slightly distorted in the curved metal. "If they could not see your worth," he said, "they were not the ones who deserved to. Sometimes it is not about changing yourself. It is about changing who you give your heart to." Vivian turned toward the window to hide the single tear that slipped down her cheek. A few minutes later, the cafe door opened and a well-dressed older woman entered, holding Bridget by the hand. The little girl spotted them immediately and let out a squeal of pure joy. "Miss me." Vivian opened her arms without thinking. "Always." Bridget climbed into her lap and curled there like she had been doing it her whole life. And Vivian felt something settle in her chest. The woman, who Carter introduced as his mother Helen, watched the scene with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. But she said nothing, only nodded politely and took a seat beside her son. Over the following weeks, Vivian became woven into the fabric of their lives in ways she had never anticipated. She read bedtime stories to Bridget, using ridiculous voices for witches and wolves and dragons. She helped with homework and braided hair and learned exactly how to tie a ponytail with 2 loops and a twist, not too tight. She set glasses of water beside Carter's laptop when he worked late and remembered to ask about Bridget's cough the next morning. She did not ask Carter to define what they were. She did not pressure him for labels or promises. She simply showed up, day after day, and discovered that showing up was sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do. Carter noticed. He noticed the way the house felt less empty when she was there. The way Bridget's laugh came more easily. The way his own shoulders did not feel quite so heavy. He noticed how Vivian never demanded anything but gave everything. And he began to wonder if he had been wrong to keep the walls so high for so long. Helen came to visit one afternoon when Vivian was helping Bridget set the table for dinner. She watched from the kitchen doorway as Vivian gently corrected Bridget's napkin placement, praised her for remembering the forks, and quietly wiped up a spilled glass of water without making the child feel embarrassed. Later, when Bridget was distracted by her toys, Helen pulled her son aside. "She is gentle," she said. "The little one responds to her." Carter nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Helen placed a hand on his arm. "Just make sure that fear does not keep you from seeing what is already growing." A week later, Carter arrived at Bridget's preschool to pick her up and found her teacher, Miss Constance, waiting with a piece of paper in her hand. "She made this today," the teacher said with a knowing smile. "I thought you should see it." Carter took the paper and felt his heart stop. It was a crayon drawing, the kind only a 3-year-old could create, with stick figures and lopsided hearts and a house that looked like it might fall over at any moment. But what caught his breath was the labeling. There was a tall figure marked Daddy. There was a smaller figure with gray hair marked Grandma. And there was a third figure with yellow hair and a blue dress, beneath which Bridget had carefully printed the words, "My new mommy, Vivian." Carter stood in the preschool hallway for a long time, holding that piece of paper, understanding for the first time the depth of what his daughter felt. What he felt, too, if he was being honest with himself, when he showed the drawing to Vivian that evening. She pressed her fingers to the crayon letters and could not speak for several minutes. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red, but she was smiling. "She chose me," Vivian whispered. Carter nodded. "She is not the only one." But fear has a way of returning when happiness seems too good to be real. And Vivian had been hurt too many times to trust that this could last. On a night when snow fell heavy and silent outside her apartment window, she stood looking at the white flakes and remembered the last time she had watched snow fall. She had been sitting alone at table 9, mascara burning her eyes, certain she would never be chosen by anyone. Now she had a little girl who called her mommy in crayon. She had a man who looked at her like she was worth staying for, and the thought terrified her more than any rejection ever had. Because if this ended, if they decided she was too much or not enough, it would not just break her heart. It would shatter something she had not even known she was building. She began to pull away. She declined dinner invitations, citing work. She shortened her visits and answered texts more slowly. She told herself she was being practical, protecting herself from inevitable disappointment. Carter noticed immediately. One night, after Bridget was asleep, he found Vivian in the kitchen folding a small pile of the child's laundry, and he sat down across from her with the quiet patience of a man who had learned that some things could not be rushed. "You are drifting," he said. "I do not want to assume, but is it because of me?" Vivian's hands stilled on a tiny pink sweater. She could not meet his eyes. "I think." She started, then stopped, then tried again. "I think I am falling for this, for her, for you, and I am terrified that I am not enough." Carter reached across the table and covered her hands with his own. "You do not have to be perfect," he said. "You just have to be real, for the first time." Neither of them looked away from what was growing between them. The Belmont estate glittered with Christmas lights strung through bare winter trees. And inside, the annual fundraiser was in full swing. It was a world that had once belonged to Carter and Larissa together, filled with old friends and old memories. And Carter had debated for weeks whether to bring Vivian. In the end, he had decided that hiding her felt wrong, that pretending she did not matter was a kind of lie he was no longer willing to tell. Vivian wore a navy dress that made her eyes look deeper, more serious. Carter held her hand as they entered, and she tried to ignore the curious glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when they passed. They were doing fine until Bridget spotted a group of older women near the refreshment table and broke away from her grandmother's hand to race toward them. "That is my mommy," the little girl announced proudly, pointing at Vivian. "Is she not pretty?" The women exchanged glances. One of them, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes and a sharp memory, looked from Vivian to Carter and murmured something about Larissa. Carter heard the name and felt the familiar weight of guilt settle onto his shoulders. He took Vivian's arm and guided her quickly toward the hallway, away from the stares and whispers, but the damage was already done. "I did not expect her to say that," he said, his voice strained. "Not in front of Larissa's friends." Vivian felt something cold move through her chest. "Are you ashamed of me?" "What?" "No." Carter ran a hand through his hair. "It is just complicated. I do not want Bridget to think anyone is replacing her mother." Vivian heard what he was saying, but what she felt was something else entirely. She felt like a secret, like someone who mattered enough to hold in private but not enough to claim in public. "Maybe," she said quietly. "I was the only one building something." She turned and walked away before he could answer, leaving him alone in a hallway that suddenly felt very cold. Vivian went home that night and sat on the floor beside her window, watching snow fall and wondering how she had let herself hope again. This was not just a failed date at a restaurant. This was a family she had almost belonged to, a child who had chosen her, a man she had started to love. And now it was slipping through her fingers like every other chance she had ever been given. She did not sleep that night. She did not know how to. The next morning, there was an envelope taped to her door. Inside was a piece of paper covered in crayon, a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands with hearts floating around them. Beneath the figures, in crooked letters that had clearly taken great effort, were the words, "I want you to be my mommy. Not the old one. A new one. Love, Bridget." There was something else in the envelope, too. A single glove, the one Vivian had dropped at the fundraiser without noticing. It had been carefully folded and placed inside the paper, delivered to her door like something precious. Vivian held the glove and the letter and sank to the floor, crying not because she was hurt, but because she was seen, because a 3-year-old girl had noticed what she lost and taken the trouble to return it, because sometimes the smallest gestures carry the weight of everything. That evening, she heard footsteps on the stairs. She opened the door before Carter could knock. And there he was, snow in his hair, coat damp, looking like a man who had run out of ways to hide from the truth. "I messed up," he said. Vivian waited. Carter took a breath. "I have been so afraid of betraying Larissa's memory that I almost lost what is right in front of me. I kept telling myself that moving on meant forgetting, and I could not do that to her. But that is not what this is. Vivian, this is not replacing anyone. Not. This is choosing to build something new." He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "The truth is, I choose you, not to fill a gap or complete a picture. I choose you because you are kind and patient and you make my daughter laugh. I choose you because when you are not there, the house feels empty in a way I do not want to get used to anymore. I choose you because you deserve to be chosen, and I am tired of pretending I do not see it." Vivian did not speak. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, and he held her like he was never going to let go. On a snowy evening 1 month later, Vivian walked into the Green Lantern Bistro for the second time, but this time, she was not alone. Carter walked beside her, his hand warm in hers, and Bridget skipped ahead of them, her red velvet dress swirling around her knees. The hostess led them to table 9, the same table where Vivian had once sat alone, abandoned by a man who could not see past his own shallow preferences. The same table where she had cried into an empty wine glass while the world celebrated around her. But tonight, the table was set for 3. 2 adult place settings with polished silverware, and 1 smaller setting with crayons and a coloring book tucked beside the plate. Carter pulled out her chair, and Vivian sat down in the same seat where her heart had once been broken. Bridget climbed into the chair between them. Beaming, Carter took Vivian's hands across the table. "I did not bring a ring," he said, "because I am not asking for just a proposal." She looked at him, waiting. "I am asking if you will become our family, not as someone to fill a gap or fix what is broken. I am asking if you will be the woman who makes our lives more real, more whole, more home." Vivian felt tears sliding down her cheeks. But they were nothing like the tears she had cried at this table before. These were tears of someone who had finally stopped running, someone who had finally arrived. Before she could answer, Bridget tugged at her sleeve. The little girl looked up at her with those enormous hazel eyes and asked the question she had asked on the very first night they met. "Do you want to be my new mom now?" Vivian knelt down until she was at eye level with the child who had changed everything. She took Bridget's small hands in her own and smiled through her tears. "I have been waiting for you to ask," she said. "Yes." Bridget threw her arms around Vivian's neck, and Carter reached across to hold them both, and the candle on the table flickered between the glasses that would not be empty tonight. The next morning, the kitchen of Carter's house was filled with the smell of vanilla and cinnamon and the sound of laughter. Bridget stood on a step stool beside the counter, wearing a chef's hat 3 sizes too large, stirring pancake batter with the concentration of a surgeon. Flour dusted her cheeks and dotted her hair, and she had already declared these to be celebration pancakes with extra sprinkles. Carter stood at the stove in a white t-shirt and an apron that had seen better days, flipping pancakes with the quiet competence of a man who had learned to make breakfast a form of love. He caught Vivian's eye across the kitchen and smiled, really smiled, in a way that softened all the grief lines around his eyes. Vivian arranged flowers in a small vase on the table, set plates in their places, moved through the space with the ease of someone who belonged there. Because she did. She finally did. The front door opened, and Helen walked in. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, taking in the flour-covered chaos, the spilled syrup, the absolute mess that only a happy morning can create. Her sharp eyes moved from her granddaughter to her son to the woman who had somehow become part of their family. Then she smiled, walked to Vivian, and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Welcome to the family, dear." Vivian blinked back tears and nodded, unable to speak. They sat down to breakfast together, 4 people around a table that had once held only 2. Bridget insisted on leading a toast and climbed onto her chair to hold up her glass of milk. "To my new family," she announced, "and to Mommy Vivian." Carter raised his coffee cup, his eyes bright. Helen lifted her tea, and Vivian touched her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat steady and full for the first time in longer than she could remember. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and white and quiet against the windows. But inside the kitchen, everything was warm, everything was golden, Everything was finally, impossibly, home. The woman who had been rejected on Christmas Eve, who had cried alone at a table set for two, who had believed she would never be anyone's first choice, sat now in the center of a family that had chosen her, not despite her strength, but because of it, not to fill a gap, but to complete a circle. And in the end, it had not been a man in a tailored vest who had seen her worth. It had been a 3-year-old girl in a red velvet dress, holding a worn teddy bear, asking the only question that mattered. "Do you need a hug?" Yes, Vivian thought, looking around at the faces she loved, at the life she had found in the most unexpected place. Yes, I did, and you gave me so much more.